Fire Emblem anime. Just those 3 words are enough to spark countless discussions and debates about how it should be adapted, what games should be adapted, and if it would even be any good. This isn't surprising. Out of all of Nintendo's intellectual property, Fire Emblem has by far the closest connection with manga and anime culture, and that relationship is more apparent than ever. Studio Kara did the cutscenes in Fire Emblem Echoes, Madhouse did the event illustrations in Fire Emblem Awakening, and with anime now immensely popular in the West, more people than ever before see connections and trends like this and desire an adaptation. But the road to adapting Fire Emblem into animated form is more bumpy than it seems. Today, we explore the implications of a Fire Emblem anime and what obstacles exactly lay in its path to being a quality adaptation. The most obvious challenge of adapting Fire Emblem, a challenge that any video game adaptation has to face, is conveying an experience expressed in an interactive medium through a static medium. The majority of a video game's resources are spent on gameplay, creating and developing systems that are engaging on a moment-to-moment basis through interaction. And Fire Emblem's no exception. So what are some feelings and experiences in Fire Emblem generated through play that we can express through animation? The first thing that jumps to mind is tactics. I'm not talking about overarching strategies in the plot. I'm talking about moment-to-moment tactics that play out and have consequences in an overarching battle. One of the magical things about Fire Emblem is how your in-the-moment strategies and RNG come to shape future decisions that change the flow of a battle. If a theoretical Fire Emblem anime managed to show a fun tug and flow of battle through compelling micro-strategies and tactics, that would not only make the show feel like Fire Emblem, but it's also somewhat necessary due to the inconsistent nature of the series' plots and characters. Fire Emblem is first and foremost a tactical role-playing game, and while the story and context of said tactical gameplay is key to the experience, it is not the experience. That's not to say that story isn't important or a high priority for many players and the developers. I myself find story fairly important to my overall engagement in the world, and the developers clearly care about the stories in their games, but regardless of effort, the plots found in Fire Emblem games are not particularly groundbreaking. They have fairly basic structure, many characters are walking tropes, and the narrative doesn't really explore its themes very deeply. And that's fine, there's nothing inherently wrong with these types of stories, and I'm not trying to guilt anyone who does. I myself have had multiple positive experiences with these plots, but when we transfer these stories to a medium where they must stand on their own merits, separate from the game, I am very worried they won't be able to carry the weight of Fire Emblem's name. That's not to say an adapted Fire Emblem plot would be horrible, but I don't think it would be great either. Perhaps the greatest hurdle an animated adaptation of Fire Emblem would have to overcome is managing the massive cast of characters. In many ways, the characters may be more integral to the Fire Emblem experience for some players than even the plot, but how in the world do you develop such a huge cast of characters without flat out cutting some of them, or relegating their appearance to the equivalent of a cameo? This is made even more important when taking into account that a lot of the greatest character moments are tucked away behind secondary character support conversations. And I'd love to say that I have a solution to this problem, but it seems like a bullet the adaptation will need to bite if it wants any semblance of focus. To illustrate this, I'm going to talk about Yona of the Dawn. This show feels like Fire Emblem incarnate. It has all the makings of a Fire Emblem plotline, and the way it is executed is pretty damn good. Many people turn and point to it as an example that a Fire Emblem anime could totally work, but I'm not as convinced. Yona of the Dawn has a very manageable cast of characters that it keeps relatively focused on. In fact, we spend the majority of the first 5 or 6 episodes with just 2 characters, Yona and Hawk. See, Yona has the advantage of essentially being an advertisement for the manga of the same name. It takes as much time as it needs to with a limited cast of characters over the course of 26 episodes to flesh out its plot. Either Fire Emblem needs a much longer runtime, probably in the range of over 50 episodes, to fully flesh out even half of its roster, or it'll be so cramped into a single season that it loses all focus. Who knows? Maybe a Fire Emblem anime will go the way of Yona and just be an advertisement season to sell more copies of the games. This may even prove to be the proper approach from Nintendo's perspective. If the anime proves popular, continue adapting it. If not, hey, at least some people bought the games. Regardless, while Yona is a decent example of how a Fire Emblem story can work in animated form, its cast of characters and limited run allow it much more flexibility than a potential Fire Emblem adaptation, which will have to make many harsh decisions in regard to its huge cast. A lot of my concern for a Fire Emblem adaptation is rooted in the fact that it has been attempted before. In 1996, Fire Emblem received a 2-episode OVA that covered the event of the story from the original Famicom title, and if you look around the internet, opinion on it is quite divided. I personally don't take as much issue with it as some people do, but the OVA still provides some valuable lessons for any future adaptation of the series. Earlier I mentioned how micro-tactics and small-scale decision-making is what happens on a moment-to-moment basis in Fire Emblem, but when things are going down in the OVA, it's almost all action and no tactics. Even some ridiculous slapstick humor is in there as villagers are getting slaughtered in the background. The story itself follows the game very closely and adds some interesting supplementary material, but it is still somewhat restricted by the source as it is so simple. It's just nothing remarkable. Most of the cast is just there and only have a few lines each, in contrast to some characters like Navarre who get a ton of the spotlight. The show is the personification of how story and action alone cannot carry a Fire Emblem adaptation. Take away tactics from the equation, adapt a very straightforward plot, and then reduce characters to the equivalent of cardboard cutouts to prop up, and all Fire Emblem really has to offer in animated form is a generic, unremarkable piece of entertainment. An adaptation must stand on its own. Because it most likely will be amputating stories and characters from a game series that doesn't exactly have consistent strength in either department, there is a lot of woodwork and planning required if a Fire Emblem anime wants any hope of walking on its own 2 legs. As a fan, I would be delighted if they do make said adaptation, but for it to truly be great, at the very least, it must capture the essence of what makes Fire Emblem so appealing. At the same time, the nature of the series means I'm quite aware that may be too much to ask for. Thanks for watching.